There's never a good time for situations like this. There's never a good time to cut off a big chunk of your supply, but probably couldn't have been a worse time.
Today, one issue is facing cattle producers to think beyond the immediate threat and ask what it could mean for the future of our industry. Screwworm. Now that the initial frenzy has settled down a bit, Jared Wareham and Chelsea Good join me as we step back and look at this from the economics to the markets to some of the new technology used in this, and finally, what could be some of the unintended consequences for our industry, both domestically and globally.
That's one of the unintended consequences of what's happened with the border that we didn't think would happen, and all of a sudden it's happening rapidly. I think, Mexico has seen an opportunity to grow domestically in their own country, their footprint in agriculture and cattle feeding and cattle processing, and that's what they're doing.
Has the industry simply responded to the screwworm challenge, or are we already witnessing changes that could reshape the U.S. cattle industry for years to come? That's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, a lot has changed in our cattle industry since 1966, but here it is, 2026, and the Mexican screwworm is back here in the United States. Hi, everyone. Justin Mills here, host of the Working Ranch Radio Show. We're glad to have you joining us on our program. And as you heard there in the opening, yes, that is the topic of our discussion here today. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But I do want to remind you, if you're listening here to the show and you missed something, you can find all of our shows by going to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com. You can find all of our shows. Or if you have your own preferred podcast provider, you can find it there too. Make sure you click subscribe, because then all of the new episodes as they come down, you will get notification on that. Also, leave us a ratings or a review. We appreciate that. Of course, the higher the better, of course. But hey, be honest with yourself. Be honest with us as well. We sure do appreciate that. Also, if you do have an idea for a show topic or a discussion or question, anything like that, please feel free. You can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Hey, later on in the show, of course, meteorologist Don Day will be in with this week's look at our long-range weather, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Now, have you got the latest issue of Working Ranch magazine? It is, of course, the summer 2026 edition. A lot of great featured articles in there, as always. Make sure you check that out. If you don't have a subscription, you can go to workingranchmag.com. You can start your subscription today, or you can also stop by your local Tractor Supply store. You can pick one right there up off the shelf. And a shout out here today to the Tractor Supply store in Colchester, Connecticut, in Coleman, Texas, in Covington, Louisiana, and in Coleman, Alabama. Hey, I don't know if your outfit's like mine, but when we get into the summer months, actually kind of year round for us, we're always checking stock tanks. And one of the ways that we're able to kind of do that from a remote standpoint is the use of our tank toad system, remote water monitoring system. I can monitor our cistern tank. It, of course, is tied in with the well pump as well. So when that cistern gets dry or to a certain point, it can kick that on. If you'd like to find out more about a remote water supply system, monitoring system, you can go to tanktoad.com and you can find out more information there, and let them know that you heard it here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, let's get into our show here today. Joining us on our program today, Jared Wareham. He's the founder and CEO of Horizon Venture Management. Jared's been with us a few times before. Also joining us for the first time is Chelsea Good. She's with Good & Associates. She's the founder and CEO there. And guys, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. As we were talking before we started here today, and Jared, you had reached out to me a while back about maybe addressing this topic of screwworm, and it's been a bit since it hit here in the United States. It's definitely been a topic in our vocabulary for the last year as it's approached the out of Mexico and into the United States now. But I know that as it has happened, and now kind of we've been able to sit back here for a month or so since all of that has happened and start to evaluate, okay, how is this really going to affect our industry? What are we looking in terms of management? And those are all things that I think we're going to be able to explore here today without the rush of the initial news that took place. So with that in mind, as we start to look at this, and in this first segment, I want to start to talk through some of the economic impact, because we definitely know we've saw that even into last year where they closed the Mexico border down and those cattle not able to come up. And the residual of that, and I know, Chelsea, you're a feedlot person yourself and as far as feeding cattle, but I mean, knowing firsthand the access to some of those cattle, we've definitely seen a lot of open pen space down in the Southern Plains, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. And honestly, a lot of our yards are having a hard time staying full all over the United States. It's really about 1.2 million head of cattle a year that we typically import from Mexico, younger feeder cattle, and they're good genetics. They are cattle that feed well. And, we've got a lot of those yards in Texas that tend to feed those cattle. But the impact hasn't just been there, because now we've got our yards at Nebraska and Colorado and Kansas that are competing a little harder with some of those feed yards for our native cattle. And it's been super tough, and it's super tough labored on top of a small U.S. cow herd on top of it. So just from a timing standpoint, there's never a good time for situations like this. There's never a good time to cut off a big chunk of your supply, but probably couldn't have been a worse time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that was something that I think if you look back to where our industry was several years ago when we had higher herd numbers, something like this were to happen back then, there would be almost maybe a different effect to our industry. But it's been the perfect storm, if you want to call it, where we've seen a declining cattle herd number. And now with this, and the concern that I've got, and I've said this in a couple different occasions, is the atrophy in our industry due to declining cattle numbers. And now, as we see this kind of shrink back, is that atrophy going to be something that's going to affect us and going to have a long-term effect? When I say long-term, I'm not saying like 20, 30 years down the road, but I'm saying 5 to 7 to 10 years down the road, this atrophy in our industry overall, I'm talking not only feedlot capacity, but also hook space, all those kinds of things. Are we going to see some issues with that?
I think so, Justin. I've got some concerns about kind of a long-term fundamental shift. You've seen Sioux Carne in Mexico really working on their capability of feeding cattle out there and processing more cattle there. We're importing more beef now from Mexico instead of the feeder cattle. And I think that that's not good for the U.S. production system, just because we have an ability to add value here in the United States and do a lot that we're not doing with those animals right now. And if this border continues to stay shut much longer, there could be some real long-term effects there.
I would agree with you. I think what we have seen already is exactly what you brought up. I think that's our real concern as an industry, is the development of the infrastructure south of the border there in Mexico with cattle feeding, cattle processing. So, we probably, unfortunately, are going to see a bit of that fundamental shift to bringing more of that beef in as box beef rather than on the hoof. As they figure out that they can build up that infrastructure in Mexico and bring in grain either from us or from somebody else to feed those cattle and keep them in country, feed those cattle to slaughter them, and then export that beef. I think that's one of the unintended consequences of what's happened with the border that we didn't think would happen, and all of a sudden it's happening rapidly. And I think that's a big concern if we don't get it open, that we may never go back. And even if we do, it may not matter. I think, Mexico has seen an opportunity to grow domestically in their own country, their footprint in agriculture and cattle feeding and cattle processing, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned shackle space, and I think it's important to talk about that. Obviously we saw Tyson close the plant in Lexington. We saw JBS more recently close Solderton, Pennsylvania, which is a cattle plant. But we've also seen Fort Morgan having labor issues and shut down. And there's a lot of chatter and questions out there. Are we done seeing some of these packing plants shutter? Or are we going to see more? And the data does show that the packers are losing money right now, kind of big time. And so I think that's a real challenge from an infrastructure and kind of industry structure standpoint.
Mm-hmm. But guys, how do you navigate this conversation across our industry? Because we've got, from a geographical standpoint, the southern folks recognize where this impact's at. The northern folks are saying, all right, I don't have a problem with that. Okay. And Chelsea, I know you've had several years working with for the LMA. And so you understand that element that, you've got folks all across the country that perceive this topic from an economic standpoint differently. Okay, so let's navigate that conversation, because you're going to have some folks that probably are wondering, why do we see a problem with this? And then other folks down in your neck of the woods, we have a problem with this. So how do we bring this together?
Well, there's regionality to it. You're absolutely right. And there's also a little bit of kind of a sector component where, like, if I'm a cow-calf guy, I don't mind the, record high cattle prices right now. Where if you're a feed yard, that's your input cost and you're a margin operator. I think that part of the conversation is kind of a whole health of the industry, Justin. There's been some really significant conversations in recent years about just the cost of production is super high. If you wanted to be a new operator, access to land is really challenging. And so I think that I would encourage people to kind of think about it in a whole health of the system standpoint. And I think that, the rising tide is good for all the ships, even if, in the short term, we can't have these record high prices forever. At some time, we're going to see some sort of a break. Let's make sure, to the extent we've got the capability as an industry to navigate it together, we navigate it in a way that allows us to continue to raise and grow as much, high quality beef in the United States as we can, because we are absolutely the best at it. And I think that that's where I see this as kind of a big picture, fundamental conversation.
Jared, you talked a little bit and you made the comment about unintended consequences. You touched on some things that I think are really hot button issues within our industry, and that is imports of not live cattle. We're talking cattle in the box of some sort, shape, or form. Now we've got tariffs involved in this, and that's a topic that is big right now. So on these unintended consequences, maybe expand on that just a little bit more.
You bet. I think it's interesting that we're starting to see some of these unintended consequences within what we just talked about, and the infrastructure going in Mexico to keep those cattle there, feed and process. And I think there will be, obviously there's going to be additional that we don't know now. I know globally, when you step back and take a look at this, one of the unintended consequences, or one of the things that's happened and is happening as our cow herd has shrank, is there are some other places in the world that genetically have some very superior cattle, just like us. They don't necessarily have the infrastructure in place to feed cattle anywhere near on the level that we can. But from a beef quality standpoint, they've made massive strides. And I would put Australia at the top of that list. And New Zealand's right there behind them. And both of those countries, I know it was kind of, and this is kind of an interesting sidebar comment. I know we made a big deal of a year or so ago, Trump saying, well, Australia is going to buy U.S. beef. But why would they buy U.S. beef? They export like 80% of their own product because they don't have enough people. So they're not going to buy anything, even if they can. So that was kind of it didn't make any sense. But because Australia and New Zealand for the last several years have been waiting for this time. I mean, they've been sitting there licking their chops, knowing how tight our cow herd numbers were and continuing to shrink. And most of our product stays here. We consume the vast majority of our product domestically. So we as a country do not export when you look at everybody else that is in the beef food business like we are. So therefore, as our product shrank, then other countries were looking to fill that gap. The most recent ones I know that I've seen some product, I've been in plants, and we thought for the longest time, okay, we're opening up the access to our markets and you're going to bring in more beef from Argentina. The initial thought was to step back and say, well, it's mostly going to be grind for cow meat, right? Hamburgers. Well, it's not. I've been in some of the further processing plants the last 4 or 5 months, and there is some very high quality beef coming in from Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. That is very similar in genetic type, right? They use a lot of American genetics when it comes to Angus, Red Angus, and some of those other breeds that are prolific down there and work in that southern tip of South America. And they don't have the feeding infrastructure we do, but the quality of the beef that is coming in is very high. We're talking all levels of choice and some prime. So what unintended consequence have we created? Our cow herd at some point, we believe, will expand. How big can it get? We don't know. We'll probably push the limits on that as hard as we can. But we've opened the door to other competition globally. And I think, again, to Chelsea's point, the rising tide floats all ships. And so as we become hopefully better at, as our production capacity gears back up, maybe we have the opportunity to jump into some global markets. But we probably won't to that level. And I think those other countries will fill those demands globally. But I think maybe where we have an opportunity is if we really see the silver lining is because we are driving so hard on genetic improvement and we control so much seed stock and we have the capacity and ability and the infrastructure put in place to make fast progress in making cattle better, making genetics better, then we have opportunities to do more business globally from a seed stock and genetic standpoint. And I think that's one of the things you see an unintended thing. Hey, we've opened up our markets to more foreign beef. Yes. But is an unintended consequence of that or a positive outcome of that, we've opened up channels to do more business globally from a cow herd standpoint, from genetics, et cetera, because they're going to need to be able to continue. And a lot of that started here. And I think we can continue to build off of that.
Yeah. All right, guys, let's take a break here. When we come back, as we continue just sorting through this whole topic of the screwworm, we hit first here on the economic side of things. Let's talk about some of the things USDA is doing on this. And as we continue to work through this, I want to also get into what's some of the newer technology versus many years ago when we didn't have some of the things that's now at our fingertips, and how are we battling on that. So when we come back, let's talk about what the USDA is doing. All right.
A high-functioning rumen drives herd performance, gut health, and profitability. Levucel SC by Lala Man Animal Nutrition is the only natural occurring rumen-specific active dry yeast probiotic selected to optimize rumen function, boost fiber digestion, and help you get more out of your forage and feed. No matter how you supplement your herd, including Levucel SC can help your cows do more on what they already have. Discover the right formulation for your herd at chooselevucelsc.com.
Horn flies stressing your cattle? Make fly control one and done with Alticid IGR XRB. Alticid IGR XRB delivers season-long horn fly control from a single application bolus, providing up to 195 days of relief regardless of mineral consumption or location. It breaks the horn fly life cycle with no impact on beneficial insects, giving you flexible, consistent control. Learn more at cargillanimalnutrition.com/Alticid bolus.
All right, guys, let's get into now what the USDA is doing in regard to managing this screwworm situation that we see here in the United States. Definitely the sterile fly thing was something that's been, has always been talked about, the development of more plants that can do that. But beyond that, I think there's a wide scope of things that we have nowadays, some of the things that are different today. But first of all, Chelsea, if we want to start with you, what are you seeing some of the different things, some of the different steps that's going on that the USDA is doing?
So this is something that I definitely want to give USDA and the state animal health officials credit. We saw this coming. We saw screwworm starting to march further north in Mexico. Actually, there was a lot of analysts who thought we would get in the United States quicker and, have been pretty vigilant of trying to hold it back. But then also, have plans for what we're going to do if and when it gets here. And obviously in early June, it got here. But USDA came up with a response playbook. They accepted industry comment on that and revised it, but really had a pretty well-written, coordinated response plan already in place. Also has really been investing in ramping up the production of sterile flies. It takes time. It takes time to build anything, but especially for the federal government, it takes time. But we have seen those investments occurring, and those investments were occurring even before we saw that first case in the United States here most recently. I think it's important to remember that we have had New World screwworm before. We have been able to eradicate it before, and the sterile fly really was our best tool in that eradication effort.
Yeah. Jared?
Yeah, I think 100% agree with what Chelsea just said. And then some of that technology that's been around, been worked on and in development now has been thrust right into the spotlight. And I think the sterile fly technology is very interesting. There's a company Chelsea and I regularly communicate with called Agrigene that was awarded the USDA Screwworm Challenge grant and going to be working directly on dispersing those. I think a lot of those are dispersed with drones, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of the primary way to disperse those. Fly drones over the area that you want control or you want to disperse them and release them via drone. And so I think when we look at now, like Chelsea said, it's here. So let's try to work to surveil it, to manage it, and to slow the spread and to slowly work through what technologies are available today that didn't used to be available before. Another one that we're both learning about that's very interesting and I think's got a lot of merit is the dogs that are used to sniff animals that are infected with screwworm. I think from a surveillance and management standpoint, that's a very interesting one. We know they've got a lot of infrastructure in place with that already. Hasn't really been talked about. I think your listeners would find that very interesting. You know, we can use dogs to sniff for certain types of drugs and other things. Now we're learning more about what dogs are capable of doing. And if we can train them to sniff screwworm, then we can deploy them in, sale barns, other surveillance checkpoints, so that if cattle are passing through a certain location, we can use these dogs to try to do, what we need to as far as managing cattle as they move and making sure we're not allowing animals that may be infected that we can't see it yet, but the dog can pick it up. So that one to me has got a lot of interesting merit behind it.
Yeah. Chelsea, 1966 was when we eradicated screwworm in the United States, 60 years ago, almost to the year, actually, when we eradicated that. And I think about, as we look at that, what a difference, just in our society from the technology, not only do we have with whether it's medicines or things that can be applied to these animals, but just look at the technology from a social media standpoint, from a communication standpoint, I guess is what I'm getting to. And I know you have a background in communication as well. But with that in mind, the communication from 1966 between people versus now, you had talked about the fact that we saw this coming. That one time, that phrase right there, I think how it's going to be handled now is going to look vastly different. And I know it. I'm saying something that we can all say, yeah, duh, that's not, we know it's going to be handled differently. But just the fact that communicating and having a pretty good lead time ahead of it hitting the United States is going to be looked at completely different than it was in the 1960s.
Oh, for sure. And producers are the front line here. And so I actually consider it to be a success that we had a producer there in South Texas that saw something on that calf's navel. This first case is what I'm talking about, that didn't look right and had been paying attention to all the information channels that were going out about what to look for and knew to call the veterinarian and have that tested. And yeah, it was screwworm. So I think that there is a lot of ways that communication is spread today that is maybe a little bit different, but we're using that to our advantage to equip our producers and livestock auctions and other people that move cattle, veterinarians, obviously, of course, as well, to really be on the lookout for signs and to know what to do when they see signs, to reach out to a veterinarian and make sure that we're being really vigilant in that. I consider that to be a success story personally. Jared mentioned drones. Traditionally and even more recently, we've been using airplanes to deploy the flies, but why not drones? And that's something that grand challenge, we saw some funding going towards that. And I think that is something that's obviously different than it was in the 60s. I, too, am really excited about AgriGene. They can use gene editing to create a male-only, already sterile fly, which is really exciting because that takes a couple of processes out of traditionally how we've developed those sterile flies and had to sex sort them and then sterilize them. If we're able to do that through technology and genetics, that takes a couple steps out. In my mind, that is absolutely an innovative way to get where we need to be with fly production a lot quicker.
Yeah. Both of you guys had mentioned this ag challenge, and I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know as much about it. I'm kind of in the northern country where we're not as worried about it. As I was telling you guys, we still had a frost a couple of weeks ago, so we're not quite as worried about it, but it doesn't mean we're not watching what's going on. But I wasn't as familiar with that. So I don't want to go to too much detail, but explain kind of what that was. That was something the USDA put out there, and maybe break down who is it that awarded to? What's the technology that we're looking at? Because that's something I wasn't familiar with.
So USDA put out, they called it the New World Screwworm Grand Challenge, and it was up to $100 million to support projects kind of in four buckets, really. Projects that enhance sterile New World screwworm fly production, that AgriGene company, that's kind of the bucket they fall underneath. Second bucket was projects that develop novel New World screwworm traps and lures. Also doing some investments in Their third topic, which is projects that develop and increase understanding of New World screwworm therapeutics and treatments. And then the fourth bucket is projects that develop other tools to bolster preparedness and response to New World screwworm. So some of the things we were talking about is, that producer education and making sure that those things are out there. That was one of those four buckets.
Okay. All right, let's take a quick break here because that's a good segue into the third thing I want to talk about and some of where ag tech and some of the newer things that have happened. I know some of that's going to come into play with some of that. And I know that's both in your guys' area where you're working with different companies about this. And so I want to talk about, and you've touched on a little bit about what is different from where we're able to do things back in 1960s to today. And I want to expand a little bit more into that in this next segment. Okay. Your pasture is under attack. Yeah, horn flies. They're wreaking havoc on your herd, dealing damage to your cattle's weight, and in turn, that does affect your bottom line. That's why you need a solution in your arsenal that can withstand an attack. Alticid IGR is the first and proven feed-through that is battle-tested as an effective hornfly management product, delivering the defense needed to keep your herd productive and your profit strong. Win the battle for your cattle. Learn more at AlticidIGR.com.
Imagine keeping your cattle exactly where you want them, while being able to tap into insights powered by a collar and an app. No Fence is the world's first virtual fencing system for grazing livestock. From the palm of your hand and delivered with GPS technology, you can set and move pasture boundaries, gain insight into grazing patterns, receive reduced animal activity alerts, and more. No wires, no posts, just empowered grazing that supports healthier land and your herd goals. 10,000 plus producers globally already trust No Fence. Explore the possibilities at nofence.com.
Our guest today joining us on the Working Ranch Radio Show, Jared Wareham, who is the founder and CEO of Horizon Venture Management. We've had Jared on a couple different times. He's a rancher and also an industry ag tech consultant there out of Colorado. Chelsea Good with Good & Associates as founder and CEO there, and also extensive experience with LMA and some different organizations throughout the year. Good to have, again, you guys on our program here today as we continue to work through this topic of screwworm. We've talked about the economic impacts, what the USDA is doing, and it's leading us now into, as we were talking about in the last segment, things are different than they were in the 1960s, quite differently, whether it's the animal health companies that have some technology available to just, as you were saying a bit ago, both you talking about the drone deployment. We didn't have drones in the 1960s. And so that ability to actually have a lot of different ways to deploy these sterile flies, that in itself right there. Beyond that, though, let's look at what else is out there versus what we did not have in the 1960s that is going to help us and give us maybe the leg up in trying to manage and handle this screwworm eradication process that we're trying to get through. Jared, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think before we jump into the drones and the camera-assisted technology that uses artificial intelligence and all those things, I think I want to pick up where Chelsea kind of left off, and really, the communication piece to me is huge. I mean, in the 60s, we did not have the ability to drive information to people like we do today, to create the educational pieces, the alerts, like we call them touch points, right? Whether it's social media, whether it's cell phone, text message, ways to contact people. In the 60s, it was a telephone, right? And you may call somebody, you may catch them, and you may not. I mean, it could be days or weeks before the information loop was connected and the vet then shows up to look at that, unless if it's a place like Texas where it's found, unless you rope that animal, drag it in the rack on the back of the pickup and haul that thing to town. It could be some time. So that to me is the biggest difference. We have so much other technology that we're going to talk about that's very interesting. It's very cool. But the time that we can shave off, it's instant, right? Mm-hmm. If as soon as that person saw that animal, that cell phone was right there and the connectivity was instantaneous. The social media connectivity, it creates that same ecosystem that we can thrive in because of pushing that information to people's phones. Here is the alert. Here is the thing that you do if you think you have a case. Here are the things you can do to protect your herd, or here's what you need to be aware of. And it's not a paper copy. It's not something that may have to be circulated manually or physically by extension agents around massive counties in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, like we had to in the 60s. So I think that, to me, is the biggest difference, is our ability to communicate instantaneously, whether it's educational information driving out to the producers, the cattlemen and women that are managing these herds. And it's not just cattle, right? It's sheep, it's goats. And of course, in Texas, you've got a massive wildlife business down there. And of course, we know pets. And so there's a lot of different sectors of people involved in different types of agriculture and other businesses that have to be talked to and alerted and communicated with. And to me, that's the big one.
I absolutely agree, Jared. I think we're using that to our benefit. I think that we've got in my opinion, pretty informed producer base, especially in these regions where they're starting to experience some screwworm pressure. They know what they're looking for. They know what to do if they see something suspicious. I think that is phenomenal. Probably the flip side of that coin, though, is, anybody can say anything on social media, right? And so bad information also spreads a little quicker. So in my opinion, it's a little incumbent on all of us in ag, as we're talking about New World Screwworm, to make sure that we're understanding that other people can see this as well, right? And so it's been encouraged to, not share necessarily pictures and videos on a social media platform, and for sure, poor information. I think we need to be very clear that the U.S. food supply is safe. New World Screwworm is not a food safety issue. It spreads when a fly lays eggs in a wound, but it is not in the meat or the poultry or the dairy products. I think that I have been pleased to see, there was some poor information spreading there. I've been pleased to see ag rally together and use those tools to also connect with our consumers and make sure that they understand that our food supply is safe, because that is fundamentally important.
Yeah, that probably, if anything, what we started here in this segment about Jared, Chelsea, is probably the number one thing that we have to fight this particular issue versus what we did not have. So that then takes us to the next thing. Other things, though, we've got some new technology. There's some new things there too, Jared.
Man, how is it not, how can we not get excited about like drones? I mean, there's some really, really neat technology. So the drone thing, another one of those, and this isn't an unintended consequence. This would be like a happy accident type of scenario, or just a development. Just like with COVID, we learned how we can do Zoom meetings and team meetings, and we understood how we could leverage technology to do more things. Well, with the drone piece, speaking of a company like Agrigene, and as they work to make the sterile flies, they also are looking into other things like stable fly and ticks to help with the problem with ticks in the Midwest, which is becoming an issue rapidly. And the cool thing with drones is they can disperse those aerosol about any area, whether it's a stable fly problem in Central Florida or a tick problem in the Midwest, or a sterile fly necessity there in Texas or places with screwworm. So I think the drones, to me, and the ability to genetically modify these species to be sterile so that we can kind of fight fire with fire, so to speak, to help beef producers be impacted the least amount, is really very fascinating to me. I think the camera assisted, some of those things where we can watch these cattle move and pick up on some of those technology. I know there was quite a few applicants for that screwworm challenge that were trying to utilize some of those technologies to manage them. Chelsea, I know you've got some great thoughts on a few of those, so I'll kind of kick it over to you.
Well, we are better at traceability than we were in the 60s, right? And in particular, purposeful traceability, when we've got a reason to really be focused on where animals have been, we've got those capabilities. And so, for example, Where Food Comes From is a company that I do some work with. They have a process verified program with Chihuahua, the state in Mexico, Chihuahua verified beef, where they've got relationships with some of those ranchers, and they were already doing, a very traceable food supply of, those cattle into the United States. Well, if and when we get to the point where we're ready for some managed imports again, and I think that we're marching that direction, we can do that safely, and we can do that safely partially because we've got these tools to track in ways that we didn't have the last time this was really a major infestation in the United States.
Yeah. And that's dancing on a little bit on another subject or another topic that's been big in our industry. And I think that's interesting because we do have a fairly robust, maybe not as depending on what side of the chain you're going to talk to, whether you're going to talk at the chain or whether you're going to talk to the folks on the ground and where they feel the tracking needs to be at. But it does bring into that conversation a little bit of some of that. And we do see the conversation coming up, whether it's with animal ID or whether it's with country of origin labeling, that conversation coming up. We do have voluntary country of origin labeling going on now. And that in itself, some of these things kind of starting to meld together, maybe an unintended consequence, as we keep talking about, Jared. Who would have thought Screwworm would then lead to some of the dialogue in some of these other topics as well?
In USDA, it's interesting, has been focused on this, even before we had the detections in the United States. They made adjustments to the product of the USA label, which is a voluntary label, but they've made adjustments where that label can only now be applied to animals that were born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. So that is an opportunity. If that's what consumers want, we're providing that option for consumers, right? And so I'm a big free market person. I'm a big consumer choice. There are expenses there. We need to be clear-headed about the fact that it is not free to trace animals throughout the chain. And so if that's something that producers are choosing to do, I think that they should also be rewarded for doing that, right? And we've seen some adjustments there leading the last 10 years. If you watch a video auction, something that's got the NHTC, all the bells and whistles, we know that there's a different supply chain that has some demand for those animals, and we see them bring a different price point. In my mind, that's what really drives is, let's make sure that the things we're doing add value to producers across the chain. And I think we've got ways to do that.
Yeah, we sure do. Okay, let's take another break. We got one more segment, and we're going to kind of wrap our conversation up and mainly do that by what's next. As we look ahead, we've talked a little bit about technology that it's out there, and I want to wrap up the conversation talking about how do we, as we move forward, what do you guys suspect? What do you feel is going to happen in our industry? Because I think that's where a lot of us are at. Yeah, it's here. We've got it. We're dealing with it. But what's next? And I want to talk about that when we come back on this next segment, okay? Agrocarbon works with farmers and ranchers to implement practices that promote soil health and add a new revenue stream. Now, when you work with Agrocarbon, you'll gain a partner that provides flexible payments and local agronomic expertise for your row crop or your range or even your pasture operations. Partnering with Agrocarbon is an investment in your land and your ranch's future. Get started today at agrocarbon.com. All right, guys, as we start to speculate and look ahead in our industry of what is next, something I was going around in my head, and it kind of goes back a little bit to our last conversation. I just want to hit it. I'm not going to have you guys necessarily make a comment on it as we talk about what's different in the 1960s versus what we have today. And we talked about the technologies that's out there as well as the communication. Our animal health companies have a lot more tools today too than they did, and I don't want to leave them out in that. I know that in a way it feels it's not as cool as talking about drones in a way and some of the AI technology in this management, but I do recognize the fact that our animal health companies do have a lot more tools available as well, and they are proactively using those tools to manage that. As we start to look ahead in our industry, I left it with this in the last segment. What do you guys anticipate this as we move forward? Looking forward with this, Chelsea, I want to start with you. Where we've talked and dealing with the screwworm, and as we look ahead, where do you see us as an industry going forward now?
Great question. I'm glad you brought up pharmaceuticals because I am pleased that FDA has issued some emergency use authorizations. We do have tools in our tool belt in order to treat this, and that's important to know. We saw ivermectin and Dectomax both get emergency use approvals. There's also another over-the-counter treatment that's available for dogs and cats. And so, I think what's next short term is utilizing some of those tools in our tool belts to manage the spread as well as possible. And then looking long term, I personally believe that the fly is really, how we totally, eradicate, and hopefully eradication is where we go again. And we've seen a lot of investment there. There's a facility in Matapa, Mexico that they're working on, and then also the Moore Air Force Base in Texas that's under construction. It's going to take some time to really ramp up sterile fly production. It's not an overnight process, but that's where we are headed. That's where we're headed. So it's really managing the situation in the short term until we can get our sterile fly production where it needs to be to hopefully get full eradication again.
Chelsea, I'm going to ask you one more question on that. What's Mexico doing? Because, I mean, that's where this is coming from. Essentially, I realize it can live year round in southern United States, but it was down there. And how are they proactively doing this? Because we're going to keep fighting this. It's like my neighbor that has leafy spurge. If they don't manage it, I'm going to keep getting leafy spurge down the creek. So how are they handling this?
Great question. And, there is a currently operational production facility in Panama that is jointly managed and funded that is producing the New World screwworms. And that's a North American facility that is releasing those flies in Mexico. Candidly, I think that some of the tough components of this is we probably did see some illegal cattle movements that helped the screwworm move further north in Mexico than it had been previously. I mean, it is endemic in countries further south, right? And so the data is there. What we saw in terms of that spread and that movement, some of that was illegal movements of cattle that should not have been moving further north. And I've got to give USDA and the secretary some credit here. She's been pretty tough on Mexico and needs to be tough on Mexico in terms of Mexico has to stand firm on its commitments in terms of handling the issue within Mexico in order for us to truly get the eradication in the United States and keep it eradicated in the United States. And so this is definitely a North American approach and a strategy that requires full cooperation from our partners down south.
Yeah, for sure. Jared, your thoughts?
Yeah, as far as the technology goes, I think there are some things that are interesting from a pharma standpoint. Maybe they're more segmented. And I think there's things coming from there that we don't know about yet. And so it's hard to really talk about because there hasn't been a lot of discussion there. But a few of the things we're aware of, I think there's some topical gel barriers that I think people in the equine space have access to, because we have to realize that they're going to have horses in stables and want to be able to treat them if they have an open wound. Can they put a barrier, especially in places that are hard to bandage? That's going to be very difficult to do in a wildlife deer pen or in range cattle situation. So I think there's going to be some pharma products that are very specific use cases. And I think it's very similar with the dogs and cats. I think another thing to echo what Chelsea said is, that it was very clear that the quarantine area was southern Mexico, and they were supposed to stay down there, and that was kind of the most of the vocal communication was around that. But I would concur with her that that's clearly where this problem really moved in the past move north was through illegal cattle movements. Clearly, we're going to have to find a way to work collaboratively with Mexico in that manner. And the other question I think is out there now is, do we keep the border closed or do we open it? Now that it's here, do we try to go ahead and get it open and maybe get cattle moving if we have these technologies in place, the people communication channels in place to manage this issue? Should we go ahead and open that border, let some of those cattle through that would normally be coming across into Texas, New Mexico, California? There's a lot of Mexican cattle that went to California to get grazed. And I think there's other stakeholders that are beyond the feedlot and livestock marketing channels that are interested in learning that. I mean, there's an entire horse and equine Western sports industry that is built on cattle that came out of Mexico to be used in roping steers, roping calves, cutting cattle, rain cow horse events. They've all been impacted by a closed border. So now that we have it here, and now that we're working in the Screwworm Challenge, grants have been awarded. Are we going to open that border, or are we going to leave it shut? And then are the unintended consequences we spoke about earlier, the infrastructure going on in Mexico that's because of that, and some of the import stuff that we're looking at, what will the impact be on that if we go ahead and get that border open? So,
Jared, I agree that opening is something that we need to be actively thinking about right now. And it doesn't have to be straight open across the border. Everything can come in. I think that there are managed ways to do that. And USDA is definitely thinking through that process. Douglas, Arizona, some of the ports that are further west are pretty far from where we've seen some of our cases. And so I think that it is a very reasonable, logical thing to think, what if we were able to start to import, at least some cattle through some of those Western ports and prove up that we've got the ability to do so safely? I think we can.
Mm-hmm. Final comment here that I'm thinking in all of this that I have been pleased with is the resilience in our industry. I can remember when BSE hit. Back then, I was actually in ag media at the time and reporting on that, the cow that stole Christmas. And it really just shuttered the industry. Keep in mind, BSE is a different type of an issue than screwworm. But I think where our industry has evolved over the years, we've taken some of those different things that have happened, and we can take these hits that happen and we just are able to continue to provide a great, safe product to consumers. The consumers, I think this speaks volumes of the trust they have in our industry. That's something I see, and I've been very proud of our industry in this.
Same. I love that thought process, Justin. I also remember that cow that stole Christmas. And this does feel different in that we knew it was coming. We had a plan. We're executing our plan. And if we want to end on a positive note, man, beef demand remains really, really high, right? We've talked a lot about cattle pricing, but almost it has become a political issue with low supply and really, really strong demand. Beef prices are higher right now because consumers want our product, and they continue to want our product because they are hearing that message that we continue to provide a safe product for consumers.
Yeah. All right. Final question to both of you. Jared, you're smiling because you've always enjoyed my last question of every show that you've been on for us. And that is, what is the book or podcast that's on your night shelf right now or on your desk that you've been reading that you think would be a good one to pass along to folks listening?
Well, I'm on my second time reading through it, but I still can't put it down. It's called The Worst Hard Time. It's about the Dust Bowl.
It's mine, Jared. Did I recommend that to you?
No, actually, okay. One of my best friends recommended it to me years ago, and I read it once, and then I've been traveling here a bit the last few months, and so every plane ride, I'm just out there, just diving back into it. But The Worst Hard Time is great. It's if you want to learn how horrible people had it in the 20s and 30s during the Dust Bowl, and the challenges not only economically because of the Depression, but just the physical changes in the landscape and never going to be a bad time ever again, right? And wheat farming and all those things that happened. Read that book. It'll blow your mind with what things were like and how that event changed the landscape of our country, both creating the elements for the Dust Bowl and then changing things in other ways. So yeah, it's a great book called The Worst Hard Time. All
right, Jared. Now, Chelsea, you're going to have to think of something new if he took, and you guys did not collaborate. So what do you got?
I literally just lent a copy of that book to my mother-in-law. It's really cool because it focuses on parts of the Panhandle that were really hard hit. And you'll recognize not just town names, but last names of people that are still active in our industry. It's a good read. But since Jared stole it, I'll do a podcast rec. Practically Ranching, Matt Perrier out of Kansas has a great podcast. He has a good way of asking questions and getting really interesting conversations going back and forth. So if someone's looking for a good podcast to listen to, I'd recommend Practically Ranching with Matt Perrier.
Yep. I had Matt on a couple of years ago. We were doing a highlight on the state of the beef industry in Kansas, just for people to know more about it. A lot of history from our beef industry that evolves out of the state of Kansas. And Matt was my guest on that. So very knowledgeable, great producer there. Yeah, I'd recommend that one as well. Guys, very good to have you here today as we talk about this topic on Screwworm. Appreciate your insights into that. To Chelsea, Jared, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Justin.
Thanks for having us.
And again, that was Jared Wareham and Chelsea Good joining us on our program here today. Stay with us. Coming up next, meteorologist Don Day is in as we take a look at our long-range weather.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Today's Long Range Weather brought to you by Long Range Cattle Dewormer with epidemectin, 150 days of parasite protection in just one single dose. To find out more, you can go to their website at longrangedewormer.com. Well, let's check in now with meteorologist Don Day with that long range weather outlook.
Now, longer term, by the end of next week on Friday, the high is more displaced to the west. So what this does is this essentially shuts the door to any decent monsoonal moisture, so it gets cut off again. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but we continue to have this very cold pocket of air in the northern latitudes. We still have the quick-moving jet stream, so we're still not going to establish any type of monsoon-friendly pattern through the end of next week. Just going to get a couple of these plumes coming through. Now, longer term, I hesitate to show this because this is more than 10 days out. This is for the 13th. This is for the week of the 13th. There is some hinting in a lot of the modeling of a heat dome for the western United States developing the week of July 13th. Now, we'll see what happens, but there is some support that this could develop, and this is good news, bad news. Bad news is it could get really hot for the beginning, at least the beginnings of the week of the 13th, if this comes together. The good news is it's a more favorable pattern, and the heat will help draw moisture eventually northward. We'll have to see. But one thing that's going on and may be affecting the longer term forecast 10 to 15 days from now is what's going on out in the Pacific. We've got a pretty intense Typhoon Bavi, that is developing in the western Pacific. And in the El Nino that we're in, El Ninos will produce an uptick in tropical storm and hurricane typhoon activity in the Pacific Basin this time of year into the latter parts of summer and into fall. And that eventually affects what happens in North America by, one, interacting with a jet stream, and two, increasing humidity and increasing the availability to have just more water vapor that eventually could get to us, eventually, maybe. So the typhoon is going to track westward, and by almost 10 days from now, it's going to take a while, it's going to get drawn up into the jet stream. So what this can do is energize the jet stream and can make it buckle, get more amplified by that first part of the week of the 13th. So we'll see what happens here, but this could be an episode of heat for the West, but also could draw in subtropical moisture. We're just going to have to wait and see. Out in the eastern Pacific, we are getting tropical storm activity and some development of tropical activity and storms and depressions. And this is something to watch, especially late July and August, especially August, because historically in El Ninos, you can have the subtropical moisture left behind by these disturbances, whether it's a typhoon or whether it's a hurricane in the eastern Pacific or a tropical depression, can add moisture to the mix. And I think that's our Hail Mary pass for the end of July and into early August if we're going to get lucky and have some better precipitation.
And that was meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather. If you want to tune in each and every morning to his daily video podcast, you can find it by going to his website at dayweather.com. Coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, with the persistent drought that we're seeing across many portions of the country, and it looks like it's not going to be fading anytime real soon. No doubt many of us are seeing the quality nutrition in our pastures quickly deteriorating. Well, next week, Dr. Dave Lahman with Oklahoma State University Beef Extension will be joining us as we talk about adding protein to the diet of these cattle. If you're looking at it, with some things to consider, and just good discussion about that. So be sure to join us next week right here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, if you'd like to get a hold of me, maybe you have an idea for a show, comments, or questions, you can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.